Hi, this is Dr. Perry Carpenter. I'd like to thank you for taking the time to join me on this week's discussion. The topic of this week's discussion is entitled Accuracy in Your Permanent Impairment Ratings, with emphasis on the word accuracy. Today's discussion is about how to achieve accuracy with your permanent impairment ratings. Now, it's very, very interesting for an examinee with a certain condition. The permanent impairment rating for that examinee can range from a low and conservative value as provided for under the strict application of the AMA guide, so that's the conservative end of the spectrum, can range all the way to the liberal end of the spectrum with a much, much higher, perhaps a doubling, perhaps a tripling, perhaps a quadrupling, perhaps a decoupling of the conservative impairment rating on the other end of the spectrum for a permanent impairment rating under Almarez and Guzman. So for the same examinee, for the same condition, the permanent impairment rating can range all the way from a very low conservative number to a very high liberal number for the same condition. And your job, your obligation as a qualified medical evaluator is to accurately describe that impairment rating such that that impairment rating becomes the truest, most correct, and most accurate description of the examinee's impairment. And if you can do that, that permanent impairment rating, whatever it may be, wherever it may fall along the range of available possible permanent impairment ratings, that impairment rating can then be upheld and can be used by the parties to resolve the issue over the examinee's permanent disability rating. So the whole concept of establishing accuracy in your permanent impairment ratings comes down to some basic principles as to how you describe and how you support your permanent impairment rating. And in today's discussion, I want to share with you some basic principles as to how you can do that, whether you decide to use a strict impairment rating under the strict application of the AMA guides, or if you're bold enough and you want to venture outside of the strict impairment rating, how you can provide for an alternative impairment rating within the four corners of the AMA guides to more accurately describe your examinee's impairment. So I want to show you today the range of possibilities, both on the conservative end of the spectrum all the way to the liberal end of the spectrum, so that you can truly provide accuracy in your own permanent impairment ratings. So with that as our introduction, let's begin today's discussion entitled How to Achieve Accuracy in Your Permanent Impairment Ratings. Okay, so let's begin. Now, in order for you to understand why it is that for any given condition there can be a range of possible permanent impairment ratings and possible permanent impairment descriptions, it's important for you to understand a couple of things. Number one, the first is that our current permanent disability rating schedule is extremely conservative. Under the AMA guides, permanent disability awards are much, much lower than they were under our prior 1997 permanent disability rating schedule. So our current rating schedule is very, very conservative. So it's important that you understand that. And that's something that was enacted into law. This conservative new approach to rating permanent disability was enacted into law in 2004 with the passage of Senate Bill 899. So it's important for you to understand that as a basic philosophy. Now, second, it's important for you to understand how your permanent impairment rating, whatever it may be, whether it's conservative or liberal, whatever that may be, how it's used in the system to arrive at the examinee's final permanent disability award. So I'm going to share that with you. And then number three, once you understand those first two foundational principles, it's important for you to realize and understand where in the opportunities lie for you to step outside of the extremely conservative use of the strict application of the AMA guides to provide for different, more accurate descriptions of your examinee's true permanent impairment, such that the examinee's permanent disability award later on can be accurate. Remember, the whole purpose in providing for permanent impairment ratings is to achieve accuracy. You want to provide a permanent impairment rating for your examinee that's accurate, that's neither overflated or overstated, overinflated or overstated, nor understated and too conservative that it's not accurate. The whole purpose is to achieve accuracy. So let's begin talking about first the permanent disability rating schedule here in the state of California and how permanent disability is established in the state of California is described under Labor Code 4660. So let's go through a couple of the key passages from 4660. 4660 tells us that in determining the percentages of permanent disability, so we're talking about the examinee's final permanent disability award, account shall be taken of, and here Labor Code 4660 goes into a couple of the different components that comprise the permanent disability percentage. Number one is the nature of the physical injury or disfigurement. So that's the first component of the calculation of the examinee's permanent disability. The second component is the occupation of the injured employee, and then the third component is the injured employee's age at the time of injury. All of these things taking into consideration an adjustment factor being given to the employee's diminished future earning capacity. Now, as we look at these three components that go into the calculation of the employee's permanent disability percentage, let's take a look at who shoulders the responsibility for each of these components. So component number one, the nature of the physical injury or disfigurement. Who do you think it is in the system that provides the description of the nature of the physical injury or disfigurement? Well, of course, that's our job. That's our job as the Qualified Medical Evaluator or the primary treating physician or the agreed medical evaluator. The parties rely on us in establishing this component, this essential component that goes into the calculation of the final permanent disability rating. Well, the occupation of the injured employee, that's determined down at the Disability Evaluation Unit by the DEU rater. The DEU rater simply takes a look at charts and tables that describe, I think it's like 70 different occupation classes, and puts the examinee in the appropriate occupation class. And then it's also the Disability Evaluating Unit, or the rater down at the Disability Evaluation Unit, who does the age adjustment component of the calculation of the final percentage of permanent disability. Now you'll notice that if you look at these three components that go into the formulation of the permanent disability rating, these two, numbers 2 and numbers 3, are very, very objective, or they're more objective than number 1. Number 1 is subject to many, many factors under the discretion of the medical evaluator, whereas the occupation of the injured employee is simply an objective fact. The age of the injured employee at the time of injury is simply an objective fact. So these components here, these components, numbers 2 and 3, are largely objectively fixed. They're fixed and they're not variable. Whereas component number 1, the nature of the physical injury or disfigurement, is very, very variable, and I'm going to show you how and where you can find the variations in your descriptions of the nature of the physical injury or disfigurement. Okay, so that's section A of 4660. Let's take a look at some other sections of 4660 as well. Okay, so now the next section of Labor Code 4660 deals with our obligation as the Qualified Medical Evaluator, and it tells us that for purposes of this section, the nature of the physical injury or disfigurement, okay, that's what was earlier described in section A. This description of the nature of the injury or disfigurement shall incorporate the descriptions and measurements of physical impairments and the corresponding percentages of impairments published in the AMA guides. So here, and by law, Labor Code 4660 mandates the use of the AMA guides in describing the nature of the physical injury and or disfigurement. So, as we already established earlier, the AMA guides provide for a very conservative approach to formulating permanent impairments, and that conservative permanent impairment number then goes into the formulation of the permanent disability rating. So the permanent disability rating, based on conservative descriptions of the AMA guides, provides for a very conservative permanent disability rating. Well, and that's required by law under Labor Code 4660B. So that explains why permanent impairment ratings can be very, very conservative on one end of the spectrum, because that's the basis of the law, which was enacted by Senate Bill 899. So that establishes the low end of the spectrum of permanent impairment ratings for any given condition. But as we're going to see, permanent impairment ratings can become increasingly liberalized from there to the other end of the spectrum with some opportunities that are presented to us both through the AMA guides and through the Almarez and Guzman decisions. So we'll talk about those here shortly. But let's just see where can we go, at least under the conservative descriptions of impairments provided for under Labor Code 4660, as provided for by existing law. So existing law under Labor Code 4660 paints us into a pretty tight conservative corner in describing our examinee's permanent impairment. And that was intended by design, and that was the intent of the legislature who enacted this new schedule back in 2004. So the conservative stranglehold on permanent impairment ratings tightens further under Labor Code Section 4660C, which tells us that the schedule, which takes into account age, occupation, and the nature of the physical injury or disfigurement, the schedule shall be prima facie evidence of the permanent impairment or permanent disability to be attributed to each injury covered by the schedule. Now, prima facie means that it's accepted as correct until proven otherwise. So what this means is that by law, the permanent impairment ratings that are provided for under the AMA guides, and that aspect, that component of the overall permanent disability percentage, is correct until proven otherwise. Well, as we already established, the AMA guides are very, very conservative. So by law, the conservative impairment rating provided for by the AMA guides is correct until proven otherwise. So if you don't believe that the strict impairment rating provided for under the AMA guides is correct, you have to go through a procedure to prove otherwise, because it's the strict rating, the conservative rating, that's prima facie evidence of the percentage of permanent impairment for each condition. Okay? So if you believe that the strict conservative impairment rating is not accurate, what can you do? Well, the AMA guides and also the Almarez and Guzman decisions provide for us tremendous latitude in deviating and proving otherwise, proving that the otherwise strict and conservative impairment rating is not accurate, and we can go all the way to the other end of the spectrum as long as we can prove otherwise. So let's talk about some of the opportunities that we have available to us to prove otherwise, both within the AMA guides and then also with the Almarez and Guzman decision. But regardless of whatever permanent impairment rating that you do provide for your examinee, the purpose of enacting Labor Code 4660 back in 2004 is described in subsection D. The purpose of it is to promote consistency, uniformity, and objectivity. So evaluators, such that evaluators across all specialties and across all regions of the state of California who evaluate the same examinee with the same injury condition can provide roughly the same or similar permanent impairment rating for that condition, unless that permanent impairment rating and description is not accurate, which then, therefore, they can attempt to prove otherwise. So let's go into some practical procedures as to how you can prove otherwise. Now, if you're going to attempt to prove otherwise, to prove that your examinee's permanent impairment rating is not accurately described under the strict and conservative approach in the AMA guides, and if you're going to attempt to prove otherwise that your examinee's permanent disability rating is greater than that provided for by the schedule, then what's required is that you rebut or you disprove some component part of the schedule. Now remember, there's three parts of the schedule. There's the age of the employee, there's the occupation of the employee, and there's the nature of the physical injury or disfigurement. So of those three components, which is the one of the three that's most amenable to rebuttal, to disproving? Can you disprove the age of the employee at the time of the injury? Maybe, but probably only by a few months or so. Can you rebut the nature of the occupation of the employee at the time of the injury? Not really, because that's simply taken out of books and tables. It's the nature of the physical injury or disfigurement that has the greatest potential to be rebutted. So therefore, to rebut the conservative impairment rating, the conservative disability rating, you have to rebut the conservative guides. So let me share with you how the guides set up a conservative approach to impairment ratings, and then under also the AMA guides and under Almarez and Guzman, we'll go into your opportunities to rebut those conservative impairment ratings. So a couple principles from the AMA guides. The guides tell us on page 2, the definition of impairment is that impairment is a loss of use or derangement of any body part, any organ system, or organ function. So it's the loss or loss of use. Loss of use is what we're typically going to be dealing with in providing our impairment ratings. Loss of use, loss of function of particular body parts. Now, loss of use is quantified by how that impairment leads to functional limitations or the inability to perform activities of daily living. So here the guides tell us that the activities of daily living assessment that we do in our evaluation is as critical as any investigation that we do into the loss of use or derangement of any body part, system, or organ. So the activities of daily living capacity of your examinee is going to be critical in your assessment as to the accuracy or the inaccuracy of the scheduled rating under the conservative approach of the AMA guides. And I have many ideas for you on how to use activities of daily living and limitations to activities of daily living in providing for more accurate impairment ratings than are provided for under the strict and conservative approach promulgated by the AMA guides. Now the guides continue to tell us that these impairment percentages or ratings, these are estimates that reflect the severity of the medical condition and the degree, and this is critical, the degree to which the impairment decreases an individual's ability to perform common activities of daily living, excluding work. So here we see reference again to activities of daily living. So therefore, critical component of your face-to-face evaluation is to explore your examinee's capacity or incapacity for performing activities of daily living. Now here, interesting, the guides talk about a decrease in an individual's ability, a decrease in the ability. In the prior slide, the guides referred to inability. So in both references, we're talking about some diminution in your examinee's capacity to perform normal activities of daily living. Now I want to make a note to you right here that examinees many times confuse pain with activities of daily living with limitations to activities of daily living. And pain with activities of daily living is not the same as a limitation with the activities of daily living. The AMA guides are describing limitations to activities of daily living. So your line of questioning with your examinee needs to explore limitations rather than pain with activities of daily living. So for example, your examinee may tell you that they're limited in their ability to go up and down stairs because that hurts their right knee, particularly when they descend stairs. So the examinee has right knee pain with descending stairs. And yet further interview of your examinee will reveal that the examinee's bedroom is on the second story of their home, and they routinely will ascend and descend the same stairwell as many as 10 times per day. In other words, they have no actual limitation, no decreased in the ability to perform climbing and ascending stairs. They simply are reporting pain with that activity, and that's not the same as a limitation with that activity. So you need to be very, very targeted and focused in discovering your examinee's true limitations with activities of daily living if you want to prove that the conservative and strict impairment rating provided for under the AMA guides is not accurate. Again, the guides confirm that the whole person impairment percentages estimate the impact of the impairment on the individual's overall ability to perform activities of daily living in table 1.2, thus further confirming the necessity of an excellent activities of daily living assessment in your face-to-face evaluation with your examinee. So the activities of daily living assessment, the point of this is to confirm that the activities of daily living assessment is as critical as your physical examination when it comes time for you to describe the nature of the injury disfigurement in arriving at an accurate impairment percentage. So we now have at least one explanation as to why the AMA guides are very, very conservative, in that they provide for low impairment rating percentages for any given injury or condition, because in order to provide an impairment rating, the AMA guides are largely based, or the impairment percentages in the AMA guides are largely based on an individual's inability or decreased ability to perform activities of daily living. And many of the examinees that we see in the California workers' compensation system have no true limitations with activities of daily living. They may have pain, or they may describe pain with activities of daily living, but the pain, however severe it may be to them, does not significantly interfere with their ability to do their self-care and personal hygiene, to travel as a passenger, to travel by driving a vehicle, does not interfere with their ability for sexual functions, does not interfere with their physical activities of standing, walking, and climbing stairs. And all of the activities of daily living that are described in Table 1.2, few examinees have actual limitations with those activities of daily living, and for that reason the AMA guides are very, very conservative, or provide for very conservative impairment rating percentages. So the guides give us a couple of examples of what they consider accurate impairment ratings. So for instance, for a person who has a 90 to 100% impairment rating, in order for that impairment rating to be accurate, this is describing an examinee who has a very severe organ or body system impairment, requiring the individual to be fully dependent on others for self-care. This is a examinee who is approaching death, okay? So with regards to activities of daily living, a 90 to 100% whole person impairment describes an examinee, and you can picture this in your mind, who has no capacity for performing their own activities of daily living. This is a person that would be bedridden, perhaps on life support, certainly incontinent, perhaps receiving tube feeding, perhaps receiving artificial respiration, etc. This is a person approaching death. So this is death is on the one end of the spectrum. On the other end of the spectrum, a 0% whole person impairment rating is assigned to an individual with an impairment. With an impairment, the examinee individual actually has an impairment, has some loss of function of a body part, body system, or organ system. They have some impairment, but the impairment has no significant functional consequence and does not limit the performance of common activities of daily living described in Table 1.2. And ding, 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 this is it. Explains why the AMA guides provide for a very conservative permanent disability rating. It's because the permanent impairment rating upon which it is based, the nature of the physical injury or disfigurement description upon which the permanent disability rating is based, is very, very conservative, because many injury conditions that we see, especially in California workers' compensation, do not limit the performance of the common activities of daily living that are described in Table 1.2. And you're going to find this with your examinees. You'll be questioning your examinee. Do you have any limitations with using the bathroom for urination? Do you have any difficulties or limitations using the bathroom for defecation? Do you have any limitations in self-care of dressing, of bathing yourself, of brushing your teeth? And the examinee will describe difficulties, or may describe pain with bathing, may describe pain with rising from the toilet, but nonetheless, they're able to bathe themselves without assistance. They're able to use the toilet without assistance. So they, in actuality, do not have true limitations with activities of daily living. And for that reason, the guides are very, very conservative in their whole person impairment ratings, especially for examinees in the California workers' compensation system. Well, the conservative approach of the AMA guides continues with some other passages and excerpts from the AMA guides as well. So the AMA guides are very, very conservative because they don't provide for a permanent impairment rating for examinees who have no true limitations to activities of daily living. Well, in addition to that conservative approach, the guides tell us on page 10 that subjective concerns only, many times we meet examinees who have subjective complaints only. They have no true objective physical examination findings. The guides tell us that subjective concerns, including fatigue, difficulty concentrating, and pain, when not accompanied by demonstrable clinical signs or other independent measurable abnormalities, are generally not given separate impairment ratings. So the conservative approach continues, and those examinees who provide for a normal physical examination, even in the context of subjective complaints, the guides provide for generally no impairment rating. So for this reason, the AMA guides and the current permanent disability rating schedule achieves its objective of providing for low disability awards for examinees who have actually suffered a bona fide industrial injury, but whom, under the strict application of the AMA guides, would rate either a 0% impairment rating or a very low percent impairment rating when they can definitively demonstrate limitations to activities of daily living only. Well, finally, as another example of the conservative approach of the AMA guides, they tell us also on page 10 that we as physicians recognize the local and distant pain. So your examinee has a local pain and a distant pain. We recognize that distant pain may accompany many disorders. For example, you've had an examinee who has had a shoulder surgery shoulder surgery who then complains of pain in the neck due to muscle tightness and favoritism of the muscles in the shoulder, this pain in the neck is simply a component of the shoulder surgery, of the shoulder impairment, and it qualifies only as a distant pain under the AMA guides, and the impairment ratings in the guides already have accounted for commonly associated pain. It already accounts for the distant pain associated with the local disorder. And they give us some examples, such as radiculopathy, where the examinee has a lower back herniated disc with radiculopathy down into the leg and into the foot. The pain in the leg and the foot is simply a distant pain from the radiculopathy condition that does not qualify for a separate impairment rating. Well, so these examples illustrate how the AMA guides provide for a very conservative approach, the far end of the spectrum, for providing for permanent impairment ratings, which then, through calculations, provide for very conservative permanent disability awards. Well, in achieving accuracy in permanent disability awards and in your permanent impairment ratings as the physician, where do the opportunities exist for you to depart from the conservative and strict approach under the AMA guides? And let's go into some of those tremendous opportunities that you have available to you in our next several slides. So in the state of California, the permanent impairment ratings under the strict application of the AMA guides are very, very conservative, very, very low, and many times provide for a 0% impairment rating for examinees who have no true limitations in activities of daily living. So in understanding this, it raises the question, why are so many examinees in California then being provided for with generous permanent impairment ratings that seemingly would be out of context and not consistent with the AMA guides? Let's explore that concept and explain why many examinees in the California workers' compensation system who, under the strict application of the AMA guides, would qualify for low or no percent impairment rating are actually receiving generous impairment ratings and generous permanent disability awards. And I want to start off this section of our discussion by sharing with you some recent statistics from a study published by the Workers' Compensation Institute Review Board, wherein they review the entire state of the workers' compensation system in the state of California. And of particular interest to us for this program is a finding that California has by far, the highest permanent partial disability claim frequency in the country, approximately 2.5 times, not just double, but 2.5 times the countrywide median. So what this means is that the same examinee evaluated by a different physician in Nevada compared to an examinee evaluated by a physician in California. In Nevada, the evaluating physician would find no true limitations to activities of daily living and would provide for a 0% impairment rating for the examinee, whereas in California, the California evaluator describes true limitations to activities of daily living and provides for a greater than 0, can be the sky's the limit, but greater than 0. In other words, the examinee is receiving a permanent partial disability award for the same injury condition. How can that be? In California, there must be some deviation from the strict application of the AMA guides compared to evaluators in other states who are providing for no permanent partial disability for the same injury condition. So let's take a look at how this looks graphically on a graph. So this is a graph here, and this is taken from the 2021 WCIRB study on the state of the system, and it shows here the number of permanent disability claims per 1,000 employees. Per 1,000 employees. So this is how this statistic is standardized across all states. Well, it shows that the median number of permanent disability claims, the median, across the United States is 256 permanent disability claims per 1,000 employees. And you have some states here like Maryland, Nebraska, Florida that come in at around the median number of 256. Some states, such as Missouri, such as the District of Columbia, such as Virginia, come in below the national median, but other states, such as Missouri and especially California, come in at much, much higher than the nationwide median. So you'll notice that California has more than 2.5 times. 2 times would be 512 disability claims per 1,000 employees. California exceeds that even by another 50%, 2.5 times the nationwide median. So there's something going on in California that allows for physicians to deviate from the conservative and strict application of the AMA guides to provide impairment ratings for examinees who in other states are being provided for 0% impairment ratings by their evaluating physicians. And it has to do with the tremendous latitude and tremendous discretion that's provided to us by the Almarez and Guzman decisions. So let's take a look at some of the conclusions that work for us as evaluating physicians under the Almarez and Guzman decisions. So let's take a look at the Almarez and Guzman's decisions and the conclusions from those decisions that work for us as qualified medical evaluators in providing for a different, higher impairment rating than that which is provided for under the strict and conservative application of the AMA guides. So these two decisions, Almarez and Guzman, tell us that the conservative AMA guides portion of the disability rating schedule is rebuttable. So in order to rebut the permanent disability rating schedule, one component of the schedule needs to be rebutted. Well, we said that the age is difficult to rebut, the occupation of the employee is difficult to rebut. It's really only the nature of the physical injury or condition described by the AMA guides that's the rebuttable portion of the schedule. So in order to rebut the conservative and strict impairment rating under the AMA guides, which is prima facie evidence of the correctness of the impairment percentage, the AMA guides has to be rebutted. So if you're going to rebut the AMA guides, your reasons for doing so, your proof for doing so, has to be good, because the AMA guides are prima facie evidence by law under Labor Code 4660C of the correctness and accuracy of the permanent impairment percentage. They go on to tell us under Almarez and Guzman that the AMA guides portion of the 2005 schedule is rebutted, can be rebutted, by showing that an impairment rating based on the AMA guides would result in a permanent disability award that would be inequitable, that would be disproportionate, and would not be a fair and accurate measure of the employee's permanent disability. So this gives you your formula for how to provide for impairment ratings outside of the conservative and strict application of the AMA guides, is to explain how that impairment rating, that conservative impairment rating, is not an accurate measure of the employee's permanent disability. And you're going to be using that word in your description within the body of your report. You're going to be using the word accuracy versus not accuracy in providing for your permanent impairment percentage as the more accurate percentage. And let's talk about exactly how to do just that. Now, first of all, when you feel that the strict or conservative impairment rating that's provided for in the AMA guides, when you feel that it is accurate, and many times this is going to be a low or a 0% impairment rating, when you feel that it is accurate, you would provide this statement within the body of your report. You would tell the reader of the report that, in my opinion and within reasonable medical probability, the above permanent impairment rating under the strict application of the AMA guides is the most accurate description of Mrs. Smith's impairment. I do not find a need to consult with other charts, tables, or chapters within the four corners of the AMA guides to more accurately describe the impairment. Remember, the purpose of your evaluation is to achieve and arrive at accurate opinions and conclusions, and one of the ways that you confirm that to the parties is by using the word accuracy in your descriptions of the impairment. Now, on the other hand, when there are situations where the impairment ratings in the AMA guides are either not accurate or they're not provided, and for that reason the impairment rating that is provided is not accurate, the guides suggest that physicians be allowed to use their clinical judgment, allowing them to compare measurable impairment resulting from similar conditions with similar impairment of function in performing activities of daily living. So here we see activities of daily living rearing its head again, and this provides our first opportunity for deviating from the conservative and strict application of the AMA guides by looking through the four corners of the AMA guides for other conditions similar to our examinee's condition that creates a similar impairment of function in performing activities of daily living. Now, probably the best example of this is the analogy to hernia impairment ratings that are provided for under Chapter 6. So, the impairment related to abdominal or inguinal hernia has to do with impairment or loss of function for lifting activities. If you've ever had a hernia, you'll know that your lifting activities and maneuvers that provide or create a Valsalva effect or an increase in intra-abdominal pressure are precluded when you have a hernia. Well, hernia is not the only medical condition that causes limitations with lifting. Many conditions cause a similar impairment of function for performing lifting activities. Like what? Well, how about injuries with your hands can limit your capacity for lifting? How about injuries with your knees can limit your capacity for lifting, especially from the ground level? How about injuries with the lower back? How about injuries with the shoulder? How about injuries with the cervical spine? All of those injury conditions can cause a similar impairment of function for lifting activities, and whereas the AMA guides may provide for a very conservative or low impairment rating for the listed condition, such as the lumbar spine injury or such as the shoulder injury, they do not provide for an impairment rating for the loss of function caused by that particular injury condition. And you can analogize to other similar conditions that cause a similar impairment of function for performing activities of daily living, such as a hernia. So while an impairment rating may be very low for a lumbar spine injury, the impairment rating provided for by analogy to hernia is much, much higher. And this explains one reason why in California many examinees go on to receive a permanent disability award for a condition that somewhere else, absent the Almarez and Guzman liberality, would provide for a 0% whole person impairment rating. So here is opportunity number one for arriving at more accurate permanent impairment ratings, is by analogy to injury conditions that cause similar impairment for the same or similar activities of daily living. So in providing for impairment ratings that are more accurate than the impairment rating provided for under the strict and conservative application of the AMA guides, one opportunity that we have available to us is to provide impairment ratings by analogy to similar conditions that cause similar limitations in activities of daily living. So this creates a tremendous opportunity for you to be creative in going through the four corners of the AMA guides using any chapter, any table, or any method in the AMA guides that you can find that most accurately reflects the injured employee's impairment. So your job is to achieve accuracy, and you do that by looking through other charts, other tables, other descriptors of limitations to activities of daily living caused by various conditions and injuries described in the different chapters of the AMA guides, and looking at what types of limitations to activities of daily living are accounted for by that particular impairment, and analogizing to that injury condition by creating an analogy to the activity of daily living impact. Okay? So, as I said, the best example of that is the analogy to hernia. Let's talk about some other examples whereby you can use other charts, other chapters, other tables within the four corners of the AMA guides to most accurately describe your examinee's true permanent impairment. So here are some ideas for you when it comes time to provide your permanent impairment rating for your particular examinee, to allow you to provide for an impairment rating and therefore a disability award that's accurate. And these are some ideas throughout the four corners of the AMA guides that you can use when you determine that the strict application of the AMA guides is not an accurate description of your examinee's true limitations to activities of daily living. So we won't describe or detail each of these, but let me simply give you a list. There are the functional loss arguments that you can use, wherein you describe a percentage loss of function of any one of these body parts, such as the spine, the upper extremity, or the lower extremity, and providing for a 50% loss of function of the spine, or a 40% loss of the upper extremity, or a 70% loss of the lower extremity. You can provide for a much higher impairment rating percentage than would be typically found under the strict application of the AMA guides, based on range of motion, based on atrophy, based on the typical impairments that are described in each of these chapters. So that's one option that's available to you. We talked about the analogies to hernia with the loss of lifting capacity. With regards to the spine, many times the range of motion method versus the DRE method is a more accurate and a higher impairment rating percentage than would be provided for under the DRE method of rating permanent impairments. So you can investigate this yourself with your very next examinee by providing impairment ratings under both of these methods and determining which of those is more accurate. And certainly you will likely see that under the range of motion method, it provides for a higher impairment rating percentage, even when the DRE percentage may be very, very low, or even as low as 0% permanent impairment. Analogy to gait disturbance is very popular and widely used by many evaluators. Probably the best example of this had to do with the Cannon case, where police officer Cannon had a post-plantar fasciitis condition, wherein the agreed medical evaluator in that case provided for a generous permanent impairment rating when Officer Cannon actually had none of the components of a gait disturbance, had no actual limp, no actual antalgic gait, no documented degenerative changes of the ankle, knee, or hip, and really did not qualify for gait disturbance impairment under the strict application of the AMA guides. But the agreed medical evaluator created an analogy to gait disturbance, which then allowed for a 7% whole person impairment rating, which otherwise would have qualified only for a 0% whole person impairment rating. And other opportunities for you to provide for higher permanent impairment ratings compared to the strict and conservative application of the AMA guides have to do with adding versus combining impairments under the Kite decision, have to do with adding impairments due to multiple impairments, for example, adding range of motion loss impairments with strength loss impairments, with grip strength loss impairments, and combining and describing multiple impairments that can be combined. Another example of using a gait disturbance analogy has to do with Any examinee who uses a lower extremity assistive device, such as a knee brace, such as foot orthotics, or any type of assistive device, that can be analogized to an impairment rating with gait disturbance, because these types of conditions that require orthotics create same functional limitations for weight-bearing activities as examinees who actually have a limp or other type of a gait disturbance. So this is another example of an analogy due to functional limitations. In this case, the functional limitation has to do with weight-bearing activities. And so regardless of what table, chapter, method, or analogy that you use within the four corners of the AMA guides, it's important that you prove to the parties and explain why your impairment rating is more accurate than the strict application of the AMA guides, which, as we said, by law is prima facie evidence of the accuracy of the impairment rating. So you have a two-step process. You have to explain why the strict impairment rating is not accurate and why your alternative impairment rating under Almarez and Guzman is the most accurate description of the impairment rating. And if you can do that, that higher impairment rating, that higher alternative impairment rating, can be used by the parties in the resolution of the disputed issue. So doctors, I hope this helps you. And at this point, it bears emphasizing that our obligation as QMEs, meaning your obligation and my obligation and our obligations as a group of QMEs, is to report accuracy within the body of our reports. Accuracy is everything. Accuracy will always win the day. And your mission, should you choose to accept it, is to report accuracy within the body of your report. And nowhere is this more important than in your accurate opinion and conclusion on the examinee's permanent impairment percentage. You know, sometimes colleagues and qualified medical evaluators will ask me, they'll say, Perry, do you consider yourself to be an applicant-oriented QME, or do you consider yourself to be a defense-oriented QME? And my single, simple answer to that question is that I'm an accuracy-oriented QME. My whole focus is on reporting accuracy, and I encourage you to adopt this as your focus as well. It may seem that I'm an applicant-oriented QME when I find an accurate opinion that favors the applicant. On the other hand, when my accurate opinion favors the defense, it may seem that I'm a defense-oriented qualified medical evaluator. But in neither case was I opining in favor of one party or the other. I was simply seeking, where is the accurate opinion? And I encourage you to always seek the accurate opinion and let the chips fall where they may, wherever they may fall, regardless of how it affects any of the parties. I encourage you to seek accuracy in your opinions and conclusions. Now, before we conclude today's discussion, I want you to imagine a couple scenarios in the workers' compensation system where some disputes have arisen. So let's illustrate this. Say, for example, you're an employer and you have had a rash of claims for workers' compensation injuries from your employees, and you're a small company and you're beginning to suffer the effects of the costs, the many costs, not only financial costs, but the many costs of employees filing claims against your company. And it's starting to impact your company. And you feel that some of these claims may be not bona fide. So you issue a dispute regarding AOE and COE. This is just an example of a dispute from the employer's point of view. Well, on the other hand, imagine you're an injured employee who has suffered a bona fide incident of industrial injury, and a dispute again has arisen over AOE, COE. This is just an example. Or the dispute could be over the permanent impairment percentage to make it applicable to today's discussion. Applicable to today's discussion, a dispute has arisen, and the stakes for both parties are very, very high. Well, imagine the hope and expectancy that each of the parties have in an accurate resolution of the case or the claim. And the parties hang their hopes on the final opinions and conclusions of you as the qualified medical evaluator. And the employer who's suffering a rash of workers' compensation claims says to his executive board, let's just wait and see what the QME says. The employee is going to a state-appointed qualified medical evaluator. I'm certain that the qualified medical evaluator will figure this out. Let's just wait and see what the QME says. Or imagine that the injured employee, who is also experiencing a dispute with his claim, gets an appointment with a state-appointed qualified medical evaluator. And he joins together with his family, and they all hug, and they all hope and expect that the state-appointed qualified medical evaluator will figure this situation out and will provide an accurate opinion and conclusion. And they all agree that they'll just wait and see what the QME has to say. Are you getting the gravity of this scenario? All parties depend on us as qualified medical evaluators not to be applicant-oriented, not to be defense-oriented, not to be oriented in any way whatsoever except accuracy-oriented. So I'm encouraging you to rely, seek, and always report accurate opinions and conclusions within the body of your report, and your permanent impairment ratings, especially wherever they may fall on the spectrum from conservative under the strict application of the AMA guides to extremely liberal under Almarez and Guzman. It's imperative that you find the accurate impairment rating that results in the fair, equitable, and proportionate resolution of the case. So doctors, I want to thank you for taking time to join me on today's discussion. I look forward to being with you on future discussions as well. And in closing, I want to sincerely thank you for your dedication and your commitment to excellence and accuracy in all of your evaluations. This is Dr. Perry Carpenter. I'm wishing you best of success in your career as a qualified medical evaluator.